Back to FreightWaves now here on this Tuesday morning. It's time now to welcome Mike Bowderdistel, host of the Stockout and our CPG and rail expert. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Hi, good to see you guys.
We're going to dig into a little bit about J.B. Hunt's earnings and what that kind of tells us about the state of the markets. But before we get there, I want to talk about your show, The Stockout, which has moved times, now airs on Mondays, which means that you hit this week's show yesterday. Can we talk about your show a little bit?
Sure. So that's right. It's on Monday afternoon now. And yesterday talked a little bit about, some of the recent interviews I did related to CPG. Talked with IRI the previous week, which knows the CPG industry really well and sort of their expectations going forward. And CPGs are still in a difficult spot now that we're going to be reporting their first quarter earnings, and so much has happened since the last time they reported earnings that the war in Ukraine has really exacerbated the cost pressure that is happening on a lot of ingredients, and all the grain-based ingredients and various cost factors that petroleum prices go into. So CPGs, I think, are still in a little bit of a difficult spot, and it'll be interesting also to see if they start talking a little bit more about customers changing their behavior to the higher prices, which, so far CPGs have had a pretty brave face on there and say, consumers are hanging in there. But you would think that consumers would start to change their behavior a little bit more for more of the discretionary items.
Very interesting, Mike, and I'll be sure to change my calendar, so I'm watching on Mondays now. So that's excellent stuff. But let's dig into a little bit of J.B. Hunt's earnings, and what is that? What's your takeaway from there on the state of the market?
Yeah, so the first thing really that stood out, just because I'm in Sonar every day and explaining the intermodal data to people in Sonar, is just how helpful it is from a modeling standpoint to have access to Sonar, where we have a data series we call it ORAIL DOML, which is basically the domestic intermodal volume, and you look at that on first quarter, it was up 6.8%. which is exactly how much J.B. Hunt's load volume was up. So that loaded domestic volume measures specifically the market that J.B. Hunt competes in. And if you don't have access to that data, what you're trying to do to model what their volume is you're looking at the AAR data, which also includes international volume, or you're looking at what the railroads are reporting on their investor relations pages, which also includes international volume. And the international volume was down double digits. And so overall intermodal volume in the first quarter for the market as a whole was down 7%. Domestic was up 7%. And J.B. Hunt's volume was right in line with the domestic, which makes sense since J.B. Hunt's the biggest player in that market. So sort of in short, Sonar helps building more precise financial models, which is huge for stock analysts. So that's sort of point number one. Point number two is, really after, Craig Fuller's articles really brought down the freight transportation stocks, we saw that, really underperformance of the Dow Jones Transportation Index versus the broader markets. J.B. Hunt was one of the stocks that really got caught up in that. And that was down, I want to say 18-20% after those articles came out. And it really shouldn't have been, because J.B. Hunt, unlike a lot of trucking companies, has a defensible franchise being so closely aligned with Burlington Northern Santa Fe. And that partnership is something that cannot be replicated. And we're sort of seeing that in the results, where the results for intermodal were very strong. I mean, the pricing was still strong. I mean, they talked about how even though there's less truckload spot activity, because their franchise is weighted towards the lane between LA and Chicago, and their average length of haul is about 1,700 miles in intermodal. That is still not competitive with over the road truckload. So their intermodal performance was really strong, and you'd really think nothing was wrong with the freight market based solely on what they reported in the first quarter. Still are having some issues with rail fluidity, having containers in the right places. Their container turns are still not where they want them to be, but at least for the moment, demand is exceeding supply in the intermodal side of things.
So, Mike, I want to touch on the comments from Shelley Simpson, who's the Chief Commercial Officer there at J.B. Hunt. And she said in her 27 years, so almost 3 decades there with J.B. Hunt, that this is the strongest demand kind of environment that she's seen in almost that 3 decades. Can you touch on what that means for both J.B. Hunt as a company and kind of that broader aspect of the market?
Yeah, so intermodal contracts, it tends to follow a pattern of what happened the previous peak season. And so we've had a couple of peak seasons now in a row where the capacity has been really tight. And so that's, I think, is what's driving a lot of the higher contract rates. And of course, the higher, the tight trucking capacity last year, coincided, with that. And so, a lot of the market impacts that are influencing those contract rates are sort of, backwards looking, essentially. It's kind of, what is is the market tight right now? How was it last, peak season? And a lot of what we talked about on Freight Waves was talking about the forecast for the freight transportation market, what's going to happen several months from now, a year from now, where you could get into that, trucking bloodbath. And so, carriers are, eager to lock in, contract rates that are, favorable to them. And so I think that's a lot of what you're seeing. But, really, even though, expectation of Freight Waves is there's going to be excess transportation capacity, really haven't seen that yet. And intermodal is a different beast because, the intermodal capacity is a function of how many containers and chassis there are, how quickly those containers are being turned, how much, capacity there is to move containers through terminals, sort of all of those things. And intermodal is a better place to be. And I think dedicated, contract freight is a better place to be for carriers than the smaller companies that sort of live and die by the spot market. I think those type of carriers are in a lot more trouble. So it could be a situation where you sort of have in transportation carriers that sort of the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah. So, Michael, as we move forward, is the increase that we're seeing volumes go down in the freight market and the trucking market. There's no doubt about that. But you see the domestic rail going up and the international rail, you said, is going down. What is that telling us? Is that telling us that it's just an urgency type of thing with some of the shippers? We're seeing some of the consumer, peaking. The consumer price index is high, and imports are down a bit. You got Shanghai down, so you don't have the volume that's coming through there. But inventories are high as well, right? Is that what we're seeing, or is this a precursor to maybe there is a bloodbath coming?
Well, I think it's probably both of those things. I mean, I think that certainly if inventories are higher, there's less urgency there. So what if it's truckload plus a day, or truckload plus 2 or 3 days even,
right?
If the inventory is already there, so you're willing to take that savings on the intermodal side. I also think there's just been more transloading looks like a better option rather than sending the international containers inland, which that trend seems to be continuing. In order to not have international containers, tied up in the wrong places. So, it does seem like, I think, the longer term trend, I think domestic intermodal will outperform international intermodal unless you get into a situation where there's, plenty of excess, international containers. But, if there really is a downturn in freight demand, which there may be, eventually domestic truckload, domestic intermodal will have volume that's in alignment, which is something that's more typical.
All right, Mike, thank you for being here with us today. Always great to have your insight. And for folks, if you want to catch the stock out Monday afternoons, and then head to freightwaves.com and subscribe to his newsletter as well.
Okay, good to see you guys.